Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar, and we're going to give folks a little bit more time to join, and then we'll get underway. Hello and welcome to our webinar, Demystifying Collaboration at Scale, DevOps in the Enterprise. I'm Jay Lyman, Research Manager with 451 Research, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Brent Beer from GitHub and Stephen Anderson from Sendachi, who will also be presenting some perspective and information on DevOps. I will just start with a couple housekeeping items. We will be making the presentation available to attendees, and we will be having a Q&A session at the end. So just click the question tab on your BrightTalk interface and submit your question, please, and we'll get to answering those at the end of the webinar. We'd also appreciate your feedback at the end of the webinar. So we'll go ahead and get underway. I'm going to sort of present a bit of a 451 take on DevOps and what we're seeing in terms of, enterprise adoption of DevOps, which we define as the more rapid, more iterative, and more responsive approach to application development and deployment, as well as infrastructure management. I'll share some research today from our Voice of the Enterprise surveys, which poll more than 25,000 senior IT professionals on enterprise IT trends. I'll discuss what we're seeing in terms of adoption of cloud computing, agile development practices, and DevOps and containers as well. It's worth noting that it's increasingly important for organizations to not only adopt such technology and methodology, but also to be known for it. We've seen maybe the ads from GE or CA, and it's nice to be nerdy these days. It's important for organizations to be known as progressive, so that they can help retain and attract good talent. That's one of the biggest challenges, as we'll discuss later on in the webcast, finding skilled people that can pull off DevOps. We'll also discuss how, yes, net new or so-called cloud-native apps and services are important to enterprises, but there's just as much interest in modernizing and migrating existing applications to SaaS and hosted infrastructure in the cloud. We'll go over some of the advantages of DevOps and how critical it is to be able to prove time savings, cost savings, efficiency gains, or other benefits to help spread the implementation of DevOps, which is a common theme you'll hear today. And we'll also look at what gets in the way, whether it be lack of skills within organizations, lack of familiarity or trust in new technologies and methodologies, or, as we'll discuss, but old-fashioned enterprise IT inertia. So first we'll start with just general technology adoption to get a high-level perspective on how aggressive organizations are being in terms of adopting new technology and methodology, such as cloud, agile, DevOps, and containers. It's interesting to see nearly half of organizations listing themselves as early majority or first adopters. I think that organizations are moving faster. There's also that perception again, perhaps. And I think this also shows a bit of the education we've seen in the market, that having been through open source software, having been through virtualization, having been through cloud and DevOps to a good extent, half of organizations realize the need to move faster. The other half, I would also add that they're likely to maybe be more aggressive than they know. When we consider one-off and sort of shadowy IT uses that might bypass central IT or management. But we see a lot of effort by enterprises to normalize and standardize those efforts. And that's part of that DevOps spread as well. When we look at adoption of public cloud, which is arguably the furthest along among of cloud computing, public cloud's furthest along. We see, again, pretty significant progress for cloud, and particularly public cloud. And we also see, more than a third of these enterprise organizations reporting initial or broad implementation of production applications. So indicative of growing cloud maturity and trust as well, I think. And that's playing a role as well. DevOps has always been about effectively, in large part, about effectively leveraging cloud computing and other emergent technologies. And I should also point out that with the advent of agile development and DevOps, most things, applications, services, workloads that are in test and dev tend to make their way to production rapidly. So we're likely to see even more of that sort of production use in subsequent surveys. We can look at adoption of application containers like Docker as well. Very fast-moving trend. And we're seeing this as another piece of the polyglot programming effect that we've seen in DevOps. DevOps is very much not a tool chain as much as it is a toolbox. And there's a varied array of components at the application layer that we see used, whether it be more languages and frameworks, more databases, basically more software components. And we also have more infrastructures in play, whether it be traditional data centers, public, private, or hybrid clouds. And the whole idea with Polyglot is you've got the best tool for the job. Some languages are better on the back end for performance or scalability. Some are better on the front end for presentation or UI. But the idea is that you use the most efficient, effective media for both your application layer and your infrastructure layer. The point here with containers is that I'm hearing that it's sort of just another polyglot piece added to this, somewhat challenging array of technologies in play here, and also a lack of standards and best practices. So, containers are helping to serve as a bit of that standard amid a lack of standards on how do you deploy applications in the cloud. And I think the same could be said for DevOps. And the other thing I think to point out is that containers have been driven in large part by good timing with, growing adoption of the cloud, and certainly better time than, say, platform as a service. So that's part of the reason we see that moving rapidly. When we look at agile development methodologies, which have been around longer, we see some evolution and maturity in enterprise implementation of agile development approaches. And it may not be surprising given that agile has been around longer, but we believe that also coincides with further adoption of cloud computing and growing adoption of DevOps. When we look at actual DevOps implementation, then we see about 40% of organizations indicating DevOps is underway. And I think given how the trend and the term have evolved, we see mostly positive connotations with DevOps: speed, responsiveness, competitiveness. We expect that DevOps adoption figure to mirror what we saw with Agile, which was at 65%, in use or adopted sort of that methodology, probably within a couple of years. But we definitely see DevOps spreading to more enterprise verticals, to more mainstream organizations. And again, I would also point out, very common for us to hear about the one-off and shadow IT use of technologies. And so I think that 60% here who said no may actually have some DevOps underway within their organization. They're just not aware of it or not a part of it. We sometimes joke that you better hope you have some shadow IT, because that's where the emergent and effective use of this technology often is. And enterprises, to their credit, are viewing sort of one-off and shadowy IT efforts differently, rather than sort of be apt to dismiss or discipline folks that are doing these types of things. They're more apt to say, hey, if you can pull this off, we want to go ahead and sanction it and normalize it. And it'll be compliant and secure, and it'll also be fast and effective. So that's where we see, again, the sort of proving it factor, something that's very common in DevOps, establishing what you can do and then showing that you can, make some benefits. I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the benefits and advantages of DevOps. This is just sort of looking at what applications are being deployed in the cloud, and this is sort of just meant to illustrate the point about all of the other applications, particularly with enterprises. If we're talking about a web scale company or a web, like a Netflix or an Uber, less focus on modernization and migration. But for most enterprises, they're just as interested in migrating applications to hosted software or SaaS, most commonly, or migrating existing applications to the cloud. And the interest is, greater in terms of modernizing existing applications than the focus on net new cloud-native applications, but pretty evenly distributed. And I think this sort of highlights how DevOps is shiny and new, but indeed it does have to interface, interact, and integrate with existing infrastructure, process, and people. Moving on, we'll getting to this is just more on sort of the types of applications that we see, and despite the last slide, we do see new applications at the top. And that's a logical place to start DevOps and SDI, software-defined infrastructure. It could also be called infrastructure as code. And then we see, after new applications, testing and development, custom and in-house apps, non-critical apps, and package off-the-shelf applications. But again, in line with the last slide, we do see legacy applications. And it's also interesting to see mission-critical applications represented fairly significantly. So I think that's also a mark of maturity in cloud computing and willingness by enterprises to put this stuff in production. And again, we're seeing a faster path to that. Part of the whole point of DevOps is increasing that and maintaining consistency between test and dev and production environments. So we look at benefits of infrastructure as code, SCI. We see agility, speed, and flexibility at the top, cost reduction through automation and improved resilience and reliability among the leading benefits. That's typically part of DevOps metrics and proof points, again, and being able to show, not only did we do it quicker or cheaper, but we were able to do it without sacrificing quality, performance, or reliability. So all of these things fit together. DevOps has always, I think, centered on speed and faster time to production, faster time to market with applications and services. We also see a growing interest in operational and infrastructure management efficiency. And that's through a lot of the automation that characterizes DevOps implementations. And organizations are, basically interested. They see where they need to scale to and realize that they need to have a more efficient admin to server, admin to VM ratio, and to look a little bit more like, a Google or a Netflix in terms of the team required to manage that infrastructure. Looking at the barriers to software-defined infrastructure, which I think does correlate to DevOps and the adoption of some of these adjacent trends. It's not surprising to see lack of internal skills lack of maturity and lack of familiarity among the leading hurdles. When we see that current technology is sufficient, or that new things are overhyped, or you have managerial resistance, bad timing, some of these others I would put in that sort of enterprise IT inertia bucket, which is a significant factor for organizations. There are going to be, some struggles and some conflicts about, where to move forward and where to rely on existing technology and infrastructure and process. And again, this does highlight how DevOps has to interface with that existing infrastructure and process and people. We also see cost and security there, and we do see those as impediments, though I would point out with DevOps, security does seem to have become more of a driver than an impediment. And security incidents like Heartbleed or Shell Shock sort of illustrate the benefit of having a DevOps capability and being able to update your system, update your machines in a couple of hours, rather than the sort of traditional pager going off in the middle of the night triage security approach that is the reality for many enterprise organizations. And when we look at top IT pain points, sort of a similar question. We see cost, staffing, and legacy software issues ranked highest. These and the other categories, such as aging infrastructure, organizational issues, and infrastructure management, again, all highlight that need for DevOps technology and methodology to interface and integrate with existing infrastructure and process. And I think that sort of involves both the technical challenges and the cultural challenges of DevOps, which are very real. And we've seen some pain inside large enterprises that want to initiate a cloud-first or cloud-only strategy or a DevOps implementation, and they get resistance. Their top IT pros might threaten to quit, and these are folks that run their sort of day-to-day operations, and they can't afford to lose them. So again, it's interfacing with that existing things and convincing people that DevOps can be good for them, and that there is going to be a benefit to being able to update your servers, or to provide service for your developers and your lines of business, so that they aren't having to do one-off and shadowy IT things that have to be rectified later on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brent to give some perspective from GitHub. And again, a reminder that we'll have Q&A at the end, and you can use the question tab to enter some questions in there.
Yeah, right. Definitely. As those questions come up, and we say something that sparks interest to you, go ahead and add them now. We can work through that queue as we get through them as well. And with some of that research that's been done, some of those points that we've talked about, I want to start talking about how, all right, we see these problems that are out there, we see what people are interested in, we see where people are going, and kind of where does GitHub actually fit into this? Some people are familiar with GitHub, some people are new to GitHub, some people are experienced with GitHub, but all the time, I feel like people have different experiences with it. So just to kind of level it out right now, the big thing that I want to get across to people is that GitHub is a collaboration platform. It's not some place just to host your code. It's not somewhere just where you're pushing your code and hopefully someone else can download it and use it. No. It's a place where you are connected to other people and to other tools. So whether it's just kind of like Jay's mentioned before, that companies are wanting to get more people involved in places, especially around code, around deployment, around some of those things, especially with the kind of infrastructure as code. When those things are happening, when you have those ops people looking at code or developers looking at infrastructure code, like a Puppet, Chef, or whatever it might be, to instantiate some of these servers for them, these application or these cloud servers, bringing all those people into the same place to talk about those is going to be incredibly beneficial to ensure that you have not only good code, but good cohesive teamwork kind of across your entire organization. So let's take a look at some actual examples into really just what's out there. So in this scenario, we have a developer from the Microsoft organization, Microsoft kind of making their, continuing to make bigger and bigger investments into the open source community and just the community in large with a lot of their development practices. And right away, you have a conversation starter. You have a really nice title into what this pull request is about. And in case you're unfamiliar, a pull request is, as will be kind of shown through this, a place to have conversation about code. So you have a developer opening up a conversation about some code to make a function block scoped, not to read it out, but a function block scoped in strict mode to report errors in ES5 for block scoped level declarations of functions. So you have all that happening, and you have them opening up the pull request, referencing another conversation. So that's an issue that they're saying it's fixing. But if this is referencing a different pull request or a failed attempt at fixing this, then you could do that there as well. And then immediately you have all the code that was then sent up to the server. And you see a little green checkbox kind of in the middle part of the screen, starting towards the right, that says that CI passed. So you have a series of commits, CI passed, and then this is a timeline view. So then further down, you see two collapsed reviews that essentially happened there. They're outdated diffs. That means as we went back to look at this pull request historically, there was two comments that happened that the code later changed on. So it kind of collapsed that view for us in a reviewing sense. But we see already that someone's opening a conversation, relating it to another thread. So other people may be wanting to know where this actually came from, what other kind of context is happening. We have that being done for us. And we see some tools already integrating that CLA is not required, that label got applied automatically, that CI is passing. So we're saving some time for people who would end up having to actually review this for us. And the person who gave those comments that then later got collapsed because the code changed mentioned that we would need to add a new test. We have another commit that comes in to add that feedback, another test case that then broke CI. You see that red X on the screen there, kind of towards the middle. And then another commit that came in, changing the code again to make the test actually pass. Because the test passed, the person maybe didn't have too much review to do, and so they just commented, giving it a +1, and then of course it got merged. Now depending on your tools and what kind of applications you're building, this of course can then get deployed. We feel pretty safe about it. It not only got someone else to look at it, so they didn't work alone, but it also has some kind of continuous integration assuring us that this is more secure and more quality of an actual application. As another example of this, I mentioned that GitHub is a collaboration platform between people, but also tools. To make this a little bit more of a real example, we have an open source project, Caravelle, from Airbnb. And this user is opening up a pull request to fix some documentation. Not a hard thing to do. It's often easy to get into open source by working on documentation. And this person did just that. So they made some changes, and then they mentioned a specific person to bring them into the conversation, to give them that notification that, hey, I want you specifically to look at this, or I think you might be an expert and I'm not. I need you to bring you into the conversation. And if we go from top to bottom there in the timeline view, we see that first commit that they've pushed is up there, CI passes. But then we have a bot account that comments on instead of an actual user. So this is an automated kind of response from an integration on GitHub itself. So we're kind of shrinking down the amount of manual process that people may have to do by having this tool, the landscape bot here, comment that the quality of code has kind of remained the same. So this person is not introducing any bad quality code to grading the service. So anyone else reviewing makes it a little bit easier for them, and it makes our code feel a little bit better about our code. And then at the bottom here, we have a third or a second service, depending on if you're counting that CI, that comments and says, okay, and also the test coverage is the same. So these things come in one after another, and now the user, Mr. Crunch, can comment and say, yep, this looks okay to me, given that okay emoji, mentioning that this looks like a pretty good piece of code. You're just changing some documentation. It's passing all of our checks that we need. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this to ensure it's good personally. I can just use the tool and use these other tools that are integrated with it. So using the platform of GitHub and the tools, the CI, the coveralls, and the landscape bot to comment on these things to let me know how it is. I feel pretty good about these services that we're using. Let's go ahead and if this looks okay to me, let's merge that in and deploy our code out to production. So, even having test coverage on the app of how well things are going is going to make it easier when you have developers working on code, sending things over to ops people. They don't just kind of throw it over the wall blindly. They bring them into the conversation with a kind of welcoming them to the conversation. Say, hey, at username, I know you're on the ops team. You're going to be responsible for deploying this. Can we work together on this? They're brought into the conversation. They talk about it, and things look good. And then they share the success as well as sharing the responsibility. That developer then usually feels a little bit better because they're working with another person. No one really likes to work alone. And if they do like working alone, they're usually not going to be as successful as a team full of people. So when your team is successful, overall your company will be successful. And we see kind of as we think about some of these pain points that were explicitly mentioned, how do we deploy some of these applications? When I deploy the applications, how do I know what's going on? Well, again, you come back to GitHub with some of this, and you see an example of this, like with Heroku, which is a platform as a service application. Platform as a service company, dealing with the deployments of your applications out to a cloud environment. And not even that has to happen in a silo anymore. So as I'm on this pull request and I'm developing it, and I see CI, and I see someone comment, and I see the code review and the code quality and the test coverage all looks good, I can then integrate something like Heroku with its review apps and its pipelines into the pull request to deploy that specific branch, that feature, to another cloud environment. So I can see right away what that looks like. I can maybe even deploy it out to production if that's your workflow. And so you start getting an idea of what this looks like in production. So you feel safer about that code, and that code is going to be more robust. It's going to be more battle tested. Now, we talked about SDIs and infrastructure as code, and these different infrastructure components. This is one way we can start moving towards that as well. If we want to integrate some kind of deployment into the pull request, we can do that as well and start bringing those ideas. And when wanting to see what happens with the deployment, when that event happens, you want that to feed back into that pull request as well, because that's another event in the timeline about that feature. Let people know that that code was deployed out to a testing server or a staging environment, so that other people, the ops people, can see that even that deployment to a staging environment, which is very close to production, went well, so they feel a little bit safer about actually deploying it. So I think that part's very interesting to kind of keep that full conversation around there. But even if we have to go outside of GitHub to an external system for code review or a Kanban style board like this with our kind of agile development practices that we have, those will integrate with GitHub as well. So maybe there's people who don't want to go through and look at all the pull requests, and they're very used to seeing something like what we see here, which is from Waffle, one of our integration partners. And we can see that this tool, if I'm a project manager and I want to see what's actually going on, and this is my view day in, day out, I can see that there's this in progress column that's linked directly to that code that's actually happening. So then if I actually wanted to go see the code, I could click through and actually look at that as well. So you have these multiple options to bring us in. And if you want to be agile and you be flexible with your workflow, you should use a tool or a platform that allows developers to test something out and work fast and get relevant feedback also very fast. When you're working on a pull request and you've integrated CI and you have a code review tool and you have a a Kanban-style board like this with Waffle, and you have deployments and all those things are plugged in, you're going to know what's going on with your code before it starts affecting millions of users or hundreds of millions of users. You can start seeing that out in production live, not just on your laptop anymore. And collaboration is one of those key things on GitHub. Collaboration happens asynchronously. You don't have to be sitting next to someone to work. You work at your own pace at a time that works best for you. So that collaboration happens asynchronously on those pull requests. You open it, you push some code, that code gets tested, maybe you do a deployment, you mention a team or a few other people, they come in and see it as well. And that means if I want to ask someone to look over my change, they can get to it in 5 minutes or whenever it's convenient for them. And I don't have to interrupt everyone with meetings just to look over code. We have our board here that even relates back to some work once it's done, so that if someone wants to review the code and do a code review session, or if I need to point back at some work that what I was up to this last week in a status meeting, I can do that by just sending out a bunch of URLs. And lastly, I think, kind of an ending couple of thoughts here, as we start thinking about what we want within our company, I ultimately think we need to make developers happier. If they're happy now, good. Let's keep them happy. Let's make them happier. Let them focus on the code and not meetings. A developer doesn't join a company because they want to be in meetings all day. They join a company because they want to develop cool software. They want to be proud of their work and be prideful of the things they're doing. It's an artistic and creative process, and we don't want to pull them away from that. So we want to use tools that keep them in that flow and focus as much as possible, because they'll be happier. Happy developer builds better code, makes a better product, means less bugs, means a better company, means more money, ultimately at the end of the day. And if we're in a business, we're in a business to make money. So Microsoft said it last year that they've been absolutely thrilled with pull requests using on GitHub.com after they've recently switched over and pushed more into this open source environment. And they said they've been excited about these pull requests they've been receiving, as well as the engagement on the language design itself. So they said, we cannot thank you all enough for joining us in our exciting journey into open source. So that's an interesting quote from Microsoft, kind of those developers realizing working with more people, getting more eyes on code, even from the open source world, is a very interesting spin. And then we just have one example of what this looks like. We have a person who worked on a feature who didn't even get it accepted. And as that feature was turned down, they found out that they turned it down themselves, knowing that someone else has already worked on this. So by opening these pull requests early, thinking about getting this out there for reviews right away, not waiting for your code to be perfect, you can realize that you'll save yourself time, your developers will save themselves time, because you'll be talking to everyone and sharing and collaborating on this reuse of code. And so with that, I think we can kind of move on to hear a little bit more from Stephen about what do enterprises need to do to kind of make our way from this, maybe step back a little bit and think about this from a wider lens.
Thank you, Brent. And thanks to everybody for lending yourself to the audience today. I appreciate it. One of the things that has come up as a recurring theme is Jay has spoken about the space in general, and as Brent has talked about GitHub as a specific platform that can be used to facilitate collaboration amongst developers and really amongst the different communities within a company, actually. You are starting to probably pick up on some themes that communication is really the definition of collaboration, and any platform that can help make that more seamless in an organization is going to be extremely valuable. Again, the title of the presentation here is Demystifying Collaboration at Scale. There's definitely different considerations when you are talking about deploying across a larger footprint inside an enterprise, this concept of collaboration. So we'll start getting into that a little bit. What do enterprises really need to accomplish here? What's the driving set of driving factors for this? So they're really trying to solve some of the hard problems, the things that are presenting them as very prominent challenges inside their business. They are trying to accelerate their development efforts. They're simultaneously trying to reduce costs, a bit of an artful dance there between the two of those things. The elimination of barriers between business and technology, those traditionally siloed sectors, is a pretty growing focus for most companies today. Execution against strategy, particularly in a more compressed technology-driven competitive environment. And then the drive for perpetual creation of value through real change in how they're doing things, and probably even how they see themselves to a degree in the marketplace, and see themselves as a technology company. Regardless of what you're building in today's world, you are still a technology company. You could be, building chalkboards or water bottles, but you will still be a software company by very strong definition. And then they're deploying pairing up, both internally within teams and across teams, but potentially even across organizations, to make sure that value is getting distributed and there's a higher degree of connection, a tighter feedback loop between the different working parts of their value stream. So at a high level, that's what enterprises are trying to do. The current state that they are faced with is that there's a sea change happening. We're at an inflection point. Software development is highly integrated in today's world across the entire business. The creation of software is becoming less individualized. It's less about individual developers and more about teams of developers, collaborative environments, socialized, if you will. You're starting to hear that term, social development. Not in the sense that people have rudimentary social skills, but in terms of being able to gain more velocity by distributing that effort across teams. Formerly novel concepts are now just status quo. Things like Agile, Lean, XP, architecture and design patterns such as microservices, some new technologies and frameworks, tools that are available, virtualization, containerization, for instance, and automation, and cloud being a huge change agent inside the market in general. So moving on to the next slide, we are starting to create some vernacular around this in our own organization. We're calling it the composable stack. If you were to take a look at the 4 layers of the blue cake, if you will, on the right-hand side of the slide, you have an application today, and either that's homespun or acquired, that sits on top of a microservices architecture, which in turn sits on top of virtualization or containerization for scale, and then is delivered against the cloud. And wrapping all that are several different concepts and tools around automation. Wrapping that in turn is a methodology set. Agile here is an example. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, but some sort of methodology that you're using for deploying that. And then at the outermost layer, it's really about culture and organization and strategy, all with an eye towards compliance, governance, and security. So underneath culture, organization, and strategy, you could probably put those into a single definition of collaboration. So how is the organization focusing on working more effectively as a single whole, as opposed to disparate parts? On the next slide, GitHub particularly represents an interesting shift that is happening inside the enterprise. And we've seen this over and over again. As companies request a move from, let's say, Subversion, SVN, to GitHub, really they're manifesting through that request a change that is happening in their attitude towards how they're working together to develop software, working together to respond to the needs of the business. Larger teams are being broken down into a matrix of smaller teams, and these smaller teams are required to work more efficiently on smaller pieces of the whole. So there's a sense of greater velocity at that level. Increased collaboration and visibility is absolutely critical in order for this to be successful. And it extends beyond, I know that I put in here at the software development domain, but it extends beyond that actually, and I think Brent talked about this earlier, where you have other parts of the business who are being wrapped in very, very effectively to the overall development cycle, and feeding in and receiving, both creating and delivering, or getting consumed or consuming the pieces of the software development cycle. So having visibility in that environment is absolutely a requirement in order for that to work. The lines between the technology teams and the formerly defined as non-technology teams are really getting blurry. So document sharing, and again, Brent had mentioned that as part of the GitHub value proposition, is something that's really part and parcel for how people are working in today's value chain. And then on to the next one, and I apologize for this being a bit of an eye chart. What needs to change in order for this to work? So again, going back to that idea of scale, And you've heard it come up a couple of times that culture is kind of one of the key drivers here, or maybe perhaps the key driver. Jay had mentioned that the number one inhibitor to new technology or new methodologies being adopted into the enterprise is really, you could define it as a skills debt. We've always worked this way. I had an example of one notable CIO for a multi-billion-dollar Fortune 10 company describe his own organization as ossified. We are stuck in our ways. And because of that, they were not able to really get to the heart of the changes that they needed to make. So you can see that reflected in the data that 451 group has come back. And you can translate that as a cultural inhibitor, that there's resistance. I think Jay used that word, resistance to some of this. But the art of it is getting the culture to shift, changing that from fear to confidence. And that's really through experience, right? The best way to do that is through experience in wielding the tools, being able to yield value out of that. So it's something that we're starting to call the wield and yield. Learn how to wield a lot of the methodologies and tools and tech in a way that yields the highest value. So how does this work inside an enterprise, particularly a large enterprise? First of all, you have to have executive or leadership sponsorship in this. You have to have their support in making sure that you're moving in the right direction. Then you start building out internal evangelism. So training some of the individual contributors and teams at the different organizational levels so that they understand the value of collaboration inside what it is that they're trying to accomplish. Not just the use of the tools, although that's important, but why are we doing this in the first place? What kind of value are we trying to create out of using these tools? And training how GitHub, specifically can be used to facilitate collaboration and visibility across those efforts. Very, very powerful tool. Consistently reiterate that collaboration for the software and development efforts on GitHub. It creates value not just for the developers, but for the teams, for the company, and as Brent talked about, for customers. We're all in this to make money, but I think we all want to feel that we're creating value along that capital stream. So having visibility and having collaborative dynamics there is very powerful in that respect. Showcase wins where collaboration and GitHub are making an impact. Where are we reducing effort? Where are we creating more velocity for our teams? Where are we spending less time, money, effort doing the right things? How are we getting more efficient? How are we creating higher customer satisfaction through some of these efforts, and even higher quality, as Brendan mentioned, the reduction of bugs. By collaborating, are we reducing the number of breakpoints that we're putting into our software as it goes out into production, or even prior to that? Restructuring teams if necessary. This can be a little bit painful for organizations, particularly those who are ossified. Modeling after team structures that either internally or externally examples of things that work better, and educating around that inside the company. So making sure that people understand why these teams are shifting. Most notably, these are skills blended teams. They're not just software development teams. They involve product ownership or product management. They involve stakeholders in the business. They involve people on the operations side of the equation. So they're really multifunctional areas. It's a matrix of skills that come together. And then all team members utilizing GitHub as the platform of record. So everything that's happening in the development domain space or in the value creation domain space is happening inside GitHub so that we can track that, and we have that concept of a historical artifact, but also some meaningful real-time collaboration happening. This allows you to tune or modify your methodologies if necessary, and you need to make your KPIs visible. So show that cycle times are being reduced. Show that customer satisfaction is increasing. Show that overall effort is decreasing while you're accomplishing both of those things. I mean, that's a real impact to the business. Allow the teams to ingest that and then take action on it, using this new culture paradigm and these new tools. That's really the best way that you can prove shifting, again, the fear and the resistance to confidence. It's going to take some experience around these things in order to do that. The best place to start is to start picking projects that you can put into a paradigm like this, that you can put into a focus like this, and then allow the teams to succeed in those areas, and again, evangelize those successes as you move forward. So that's what I've got for my section of the presentation. I think now we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience.
Yes, we are. Thanks, Stephen. And I would encourage our audience members to go ahead, click the question tab, and give us your questions, and we'll answer them as best we can here. the first one that we have deals with something Stephen was just sort of talking about. And the question is, and perhaps I'll let you gentlemen answer this first, and maybe I can weigh in, but what is the easiest first step to changing the mindset of software development?
So I'll jump in. This is Stephen. From our working perspective, what we've seen, and again, this goes back to the idea of activity breeds that confidence, is to take on a project, usually something that's encapsulated in some way. So if you've got a bit of a Jenga architecture situation going on inside your enterprise, you're going to want to parse something out so that you can contain not just the effort, but also show a before and after, right? So that you can say, before we had undertaken this effort, the work looked like this. After we've made this change, but from a cultural level and from a platform point of view by using GitHub, look at the net effect, right? So you baselined and then you've shown that, but you've shown it through activity. It hasn't been academic, it's been very, very practical. So do it through the work. Pick some work and then execute.
Yeah, and just riffing off that a little bit too, I think a good first step is just showing some examples, talking to some other people out in the industry that share the kind of similar industry as you. So if you are in financials, talk to other people in financial. If you're in the retail sector, talk to people in retail. If you're just a startup, look at the other startups that are out on GitHub or the other companies that are using GitHub Enterprise. Talk to them, see some of those use cases and those customer stories, and think about that and maybe get some people behind that idea. When they see that and we start seeing that, when it's not just one person proposing something and getting more people to change their ideas about software development, it seems like when you get a consensus, it's just easier to move over there. Once you have, you're going to need to prove that it's actually doing well. You have that proof of concept. Get people to actually work together. Get those tools integrated. Make it feel like it's the actual software development lifecycle that you're dreaming of. When you start making those steps little by little, other people are going to want to jump on board. Certain actions on GitHub are, of course, very sticky. Sending a pull request, bringing someone into a conversation. When that happens, it's easy to start moving towards this idea of DevOps ultimately.
Yep. And this is Jay. I'd say it's also about sort of showing the benefit, not just the burden, presenting that to folks. That this is going to make your life better. This is going to mean smoother operation, less of a minefield, and you're going to be a part of an organization that's more responsive to the next, security incident, application, event, device, whatever it might be. But give people some skin in that sort of readiness part of DevOps, and help this. You sort of need to dispel the no ops myth that people are going to be, fired or told to go away, because there is a need for IT operations folks, and they are going to have important work to do. It's basically a transition from, some of the scripting manual things that they maybe don't like doing to, more cloud-oriented DevOps type things that are more effective and, as I said, sort of makes their lives better. Another question we have is who else beyond developers and IT operations teams tend to be involved in enterprise DevOps implementations? And I'll take a whack at this and then throw it over to our other speakers. But, I'd say that I already mentioned that security has become a driver, I think a positive force in DevOps. We've seen some convergence there, which is a good thing. So certainly security teams and professionals get pulled into DevOps implementations, particularly with large enterprises. We see pretty heavy involvement from the database administrators and data analytics folks. And ultimately, this is about sort of, business and competitiveness. So working successful DevOps implementations tend to pull in lines of business and business requirements folks. They're helping to sort of drive, the real payoff from accomplishing these DevOps implementations, whether it be faster time to market, responsiveness, or serving your customers. Guys, what do you think on this about the other stakeholders that tend to get pulled into DevOps?
Yeah, I think people who, really just anyone who's involved with code, whether it's a developer, someone who's deciding, making business decisions, a data scientist, or some user researcher at your company, or a project manager, or really anyone who could benefit from code going well, applications being built smoothly, someone who might be jealous of your team doing better than theirs. Those people are going to be involved in kind of this DevOps practice.
And we couldn't agree more on both of those fronts. I think we're also surprisingly seeing a lot of involvement at the C-level. And Jay, you were alluding to this a little bit earlier. They are very much enthused by the idea of the value that DevOps can create for the organization. So increased velocity, decreasing quality. There's a bit of a cost to value ratio that most of the executives have their eye keenly focused on. So anything that has the promise of reducing cost while simultaneously increasing value is extremely attractive. And DevOps fits squarely into that.
Right, and that coincides with, we have seen more sort of top-down adoption. I mean, this is still very much sort of a grassroots, developer-driven, line of business-driven type of thing, but we are seeing more involvement from managerial, from C-level executives that are helping to push this. And that's another word of advice to DevOps implementers in the enterprise is, get that buy-in from leadership, from management, because you're going to need it. There is resistance, and it is challenging. But again, it's usually about proving it and then spreading it within the organization. Let's take another question here. This was probably primarily for Brent. If I want to use GitHub for transitioning into a DevOps mindset, do I have to use GitHub Enterprise? Brent?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. A lot of people think DevOps and they think it within their large company or things like that, but it can be within the smaller companies using GitHub.com as well. It doesn't have to be GitHub Enterprise. It can be GitHub.com as well, because a lot of these tools that work in GitHub Enterprise are going to work on GitHub.com to allow your developers to work the best way that they can, and the teams of people who are going to be interacting with them to interact in the best way that they can. So I would say you don't have to use GitHub Enterprise, which I guess may be contradictory to what a lot of people would expect me to say. Use the open source tool. That's the tool that's best for you. Ultimately, I care about developers being happy. I've mentioned I'd like to see that role at other companies, but I just like to see developers being happy at any level of an organization.
Right, and I think that's where a lot of enterprises are in terms of they need to better serve their developers. I mentioned shadowy IT. Developers and their teams seem to be aware they can't push something to production, on public cloud or without, central IT or it being sanctioned. The IT operations pros, at the same time, understand that they're sort of under pressure to better serve their developers and teams to be more responsive, and they're competing, in a sense, with public cloud and SaaS and open source software. But it's pretty common to see organizations using the open source software, particularly when they're sort of initiating these things and at that sort of proof point stage. So I think we have one more question we'll take here. What industries are furthest along with DevOps, and where is it most common? And I'll answer this first. I think we're well beyond sort of the early adopters of web scale companies that were the first to sort of bring DevOps, usher in the trend, if you will. And I think we're even beyond the bleeding edge enterprises, which are certainly still doing DevOps, but it's beyond limited. It's beyond the limitations to just those organizations like big banks, insurance firms, telecom companies. And we're seeing it really across the board in pretty much all enterprise verticals. We hear about it in retail, manufacturing, pharmaceutical and life sciences, the public sector. So I think it is indicative of the spread to much more mainstream enterprises. And all the while, the early adopters that were web scale and banks and insurance companies are now well along with their implementations of DevOps, many of them. And we're seeing it, that they have managed to establish it and spread it throughout the organization. The sort of enterprise-wide deployments of DevOps are kind of just starting, but they are happening. And so the trend's moving pretty steadily.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because we talk about software eating world. That's kind of a quote from Mark Andreessen. Software eating world. Well, what companies are software companies now? I can honestly say that I don't run across many companies that don't have some software component, whether it's in-house or some external amount of contractors. Everyone has software. So software is eating the world, and all companies are starting to become software companies. Well, software is developed on GitHub. That's where 14 million users use the site to contribute and build an application. So you really see this across all industries, like you said. It's interesting to see it in telecom and think about it in retail or automotive, but you see it in all those big companies, whether they're contributing back to open source or they're just doing it inside the company at these 10,000 users or bigger company, doing their own internal kind of open source, kind of called inner source. So you see it everywhere. It's great.
And we're definitely seeing that balance as well. Across verticals, across enterprise sizes, across enterprise maturation, you are definitely seeing DevOps working its way in, and sometimes, as Jay has mentioned, top-down, other times from the ground level up. But everybody's got the desire to move faster and do more with less, right? Be able to do more with less. And DevOps is the realization of that promise.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Brent. And thanks to our listeners for attending. A reminder, the presentation will be made available to attendees, but we thank you for your time today and appreciate the discussion. Have a good rest of your day.
Yep, thank you, everyone. And don't forget, when you leave the session, to give some feedback so that we can be better presenters and ultimately give better webinars to everyone. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care.